cheating millionaire runs into his ex-pregnant wife, but seeing the kids beside her leaves him. High-rise apartments, designer suits, and an empire built on ambition. Leonard Chambers had it all, or so it seemed. The self-made millionaire glided through Manhattan's elite circles with a gleaming smile that masked the secrets of a crumbling marriage. By the time the tabloids uncovered his affair, it was too late. His wife of 10 years, Sarah, walked out the door, two little hands clinging to hers and heartbreak tightening her chest. Now, years later, a chance encounter on a bustling city street threatens to unravel Leonard's carefully curated new life, because beside Sarah stand the children he abandoned, and in an instant his world tilts on its axis. Leonard Chambers was born into a working-class family on the outskirts of Chicago. His father, Jonathan Chambers, drove a city bus, and his mother, Irene, worked as a seamstress in a small garment factory. They struggled to make ends meet, but they did everything possible to support Leonard's voracious curiosity. By his teens, he exhibited an uncanny knack for numbers and an almost obsessive interest in technology. He devoured business books from the local library, studying the strategies of titans like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. After earning a scholarship to Northwestern University, Leonard's path to success accelerated. He majored in finance, then forged key connections at every internship. One summer, he landed a spot at Friedman and Friedman Associates, a respected venture capital firm run by the sagacious Donald Friedman and his daughter, Lisa Friedman. They became mentors to Leonard, spotting in him a rare blend of analytical brilliance and unrelenting drive. By the time he graduated, Friedman and Friedman offered him a role in their expanding Manhattan office. It was in New York that Leonard's fortunes soared. He identified emerging tech startups and convinced Friedman and Friedman to invest. Each success gilded his reputation. By age 30, he was heading up a new division, traveling globally to assess potential acquisitions. His bank account ballooned, and with it came a penthouse apartment in Midtown, the sleek suits, and a growing appetite for recognition among the city's elite. Amid these heady years, Leonard met Sarah Henderson. She was a freelance graphic designer working at a conference Friedman and Friedman organized. Sarah's quiet warmth contrasted sharply with the brash New York hustle. He courted her with lavish dinners, promising her a future free of the financial woes that had dogged his own parents. Sarah, initially wary, found herself enthralled by his intellect and devotion. They married in a well-publicized ceremony at the Astoria Grand Hotel. The Friedmans, along with Mark Cuban and a slew of other influential figures, attended. Photos from the glamorous event circulated in business magazines and society pages, painting Leonard and Sarah as a golden couple, beauty, wealth, and unstoppable ambition. Yet cracks formed beneath the glossy surface. As Friedman and Friedman soared on Leonard's deals, so did his workload and his ego. He worked late nights, traveled constantly, and entertained a parade of potential clients or co-investors in exclusive clubs. The once deep conversations with Sarah were replaced by fleeting chats over rushed breakfasts. She felt him slipping away, and he seemed increasingly distant. Two children, Sophie and Brandon, were born into an environment of partial togetherness, with a father who showered them with gifts, but struggled to give them time. When rumors of Leonard's affair began circulating, many brushed it off as typical tabloid fodder. Sarah, though, had caught the clues: whispered phone calls, suspicious business trips, and endless client dinners. Confronting him led to explosive arguments, culminating in the stark realization that the life they built was as precarious as a house of cards. Sarah demanded honesty, and Leonard gave a half-hearted confession that broke them both. The divorce proceedings made headlines. Friedman, and Friedman discreetly distanced themselves from the scandal. Sarah withdrew from public life to shield Sophie and Brandon from the glare of paparazzi, and Leonard, though regretful, seemed more concerned about preserving his deals and his image. Amid the swirl of accusations, heartbreak, and legal battles, Sarah packed her bags, took the children, and left New York for a quieter existence back in her hometown near Boston. Leonard rarely saw them, funneling child support payments through attorneys and burying himself deeper in business pursuits, determined to rebound from personal disaster. Once the divorce was final, Sarah Henderson no longer Chambers tried to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. She returned to Boston, where her grandmother's old house stood in a tree-lined suburban neighborhood. Although it required some work, the cozy space offered a refuge for her and the kids. Gone were the days of penthouse views and catered brunches. Instead, Sarah took solace in simple routines, morning walks with Sophie and Brandon, arts and crafts sessions in the small living room, and quiet dinners that ended with bedtime stories. Financially, she was stable thanks to the divorce settlement and Leonard's child support, but Sarah refused to live idly on that money alone. She resurrected her freelance design career, working from a sunlit nook in the house. Over time, she cultivated a respectable list of clients, some from her old NYC connections and a growing number from local businesses. The steady stream of work kept her mind occupied, an antidote to memories of heartbreak. Sophie, 8, and Brandon, 6, adapted to their new environment with surprising resilience. Sophie inherited her mother's artistic inclination, often sketching elaborate pictures of their old apartment or dreamlike cityscapes. Brandon, more reserved, clung to stuffed animals and bedtime routines for comfort, occasionally asking, "When will Daddy visit?" Sarah would muster a gentle smile, explaining that Leonard's work was complicated, but he loved them. It was the best she could do to maintain a positive image of their father, even though a part of her still seethed at his betrayal. Leonard, on the other hand, made occasional efforts to contact the kids, calls that often ended awkwardly. He'd promised to visit soon or send them a new gadget, but the visits never quite materialized. Business obligations, he insisted, always arose at the last minute. Friedman had recovered from the scandal, partly by diminishing Leonard's role in public events. Nonetheless, they valued his strategic mind enough to keep him on. Leonard poured himself into acquisitions, forging new alliances and launching side ventures, trying to recast his personal brand as a dynamic but solitary mogul. The affair that wrecked his marriage fizzled quickly. The woman, a marketing executive named Marina Blake, wasn't keen on being associated with the fallout. She parted ways with Leonard soon after the divorce, leaving him with a bruised ego and a deep sense of regret he refused to fully acknowledge. Instead, he sought validation in high-stakes deals and lavish parties. Loneliness crept in, but he buried it under layers of rationalization. "I have no time for emotional entanglements." Behind the scenes, Friedman quietly introduced new rising stars, like Anthony Delgado, a sharp-witted analyst who began overshadowing Leonard. Whispers circulated that Leonard's best days might be behind him, yet outwardly he maintained the facade of unshakable success. He doubled down on philanthropic events, sometimes appearing at black-tie galas where he'd donate large sums to children's charities, ironically claiming an interest in supporting families in need. Back in Boston, Sarah caught snippets of his doings in business magazines. She rarely let them bother her. Her life now revolved around the kids, her work, and a budding sense of peace she was determined to protect. The last thing she expected was for their paths to cross again, especially not in a way that would test her resolve to move forward and Leonard's long-repressed remorse. One crisp autumn weekend, Sarah decided it was time for a small getaway. Sophie and Brandon had been clamoring for a trip somewhere exciting. Sarah's friend, Carrie Martin, who lived in New York City's Upper West Side, invited them to visit and take advantage of the city's cultural offerings. Carrie had a daughter, Fiona, close in age to Sophie. They could spend a couple of days exploring museums, visiting Central Park, and watching a Broadway matinee. Sarah hesitated at first. New York was the city of her broken marriage, and the place she'd fled to rebuild her life. But she also knew she couldn't shield the kids from the city forever, nor from the world associated with their father. So she accepted Carrie's invitation and planned a family-friendly itinerary, hoping to avoid any old haunts that might stir painful memories. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the city's hustle instantly reminding Sarah of what she had once lived among: the endless traffic, the towering skyscrapers, the swirling blend of languages on every street corner. Sophie gaped at the buildings with wide-eyed curiosity, while Brandon held Sarah's hand tightly, as though the bustling crowds made him nervous. Carrie's apartment offered a warm welcome, a swirl of laughter, and immediate chatter about the weekend plans. Saturday morning dawned bright, and they headed off to the American Museum of Natural History, the kids enchanted by dinosaur skeletons and sparkling gem exhibits. By midday, everyone was starving, so they strolled to a nearby burger place that Carrie swore was the best in Manhattan. Inside the crowded restaurant, Sarah scanned for an available table. Carrie spotted a small booth in the corner. As Sarah guided Sophie and Brandon through the throng of diners, her gaze snagged on a familiar profile across the room. Seated at a table near the window was Leonard Chambers, in a crisp jacket, a tablet on the table, probably scanning market reports or a pitch deck. The shock reverberated through Sarah's body like a jolt of electricity. She froze. Her mind raced with questions. What is he doing here? Should I turn around? Will he see us? But it was too late. Leonard looked up from his tablet, and their eyes locked. His expression went from neutral to stunned in a heartbeat. The restaurant seemed to quiet, or perhaps it was only in Sarah's mind. She felt Carrie's hand on her arm, a silent gesture of support. Sophie and Brandon, oblivious, craned their necks to see what had caused their mom to stop abruptly. Then they recognized their father, the man they'd barely glimpsed in person for years, only in photos or on rare video calls. Leonard stood, nearly knocking his coffee mug over. He took a step forward, mouth slightly agape, as if words were failing him. It felt as though time stretched painfully. Sarah's protective instincts flared. She braced herself, uncertain how this moment would unfold. All she knew was that the life she had so carefully rebuilt was colliding with the life she had left behind, and the two innocent children by her side were about to see their father in the flesh, likely for the first time since they were toddlers. Sophie's face lit up with recognition, her eyes darting between Sarah and Leonard. Brandon clutched Sarah's hand so tightly it hurt, his little body trembling with confusion rather than joy. Sarah found herself struggling to breathe, her heart pounding in her ears. Every rational part of her wanted to whisk her children out of the restaurant before old wounds reopened, but a stronger, calmer voice within whispered, "They deserve to see him. This is their father, after all." Leonard's gaze flickered to the kids, and in that instant, the self-assured millionaire seemed to crumble from within. His eyes welled up as he noticed how much they had grown, the unmistakable resemblance they shared with him. Sophie, tall and poised, and Brandon, smaller but with the same determined set to his jaw that Leonard once saw in the mirror. Emotions he had long buried forced their way to the surface. Sarah steadied herself. She cleared her throat, forcing her voice to remain composed. "Leonard," she said simply, "it's been a while." He blinked, struggling to form words. Yes, it has." He tore his gaze from Sarah to focus on Sophie and Brandon. "Hi, kids," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Sophie, Ever the inquisitive one opened her mouth first. "Dad? Mom said you live in New York. Why didn't you ever visit us?" The question hung in the air, laden with the innocence of childhood, cutting straight to the core of adult failings. Leonard stammered, I wanted to. Things were complicated. He glanced at Sarah, as if searching for a lifeline, but she wouldn't rescue him from the truth he had to face. The awkward silence was broken by Carrie, who gently suggested they combine tables if everyone was comfortable. Sarah looked at her children, reading the flicker of curiosity and longing in their eyes. Against every protective instinct, she nodded. Maybe it's time they have a chance to talk, no matter how brief and painful. They pushed 2 tables together. Leonard, flustered, sat across from Sophie and Brandon. Sarah slid in next to Carrie at a slight distance, ready to intervene if the conversation went south. Brandon, too shy to speak at first, studied Leonard's face intently. Sarah guessed he was trying to match the real man to the photos he'd glimpsed in old albums. Leonard cleared his throat. "How are you both? You must be 8 and 6 now, right?" He tried to smile, though it wavered. Sophie nodded. "I'm 8. Brandon is 6. I'm in 3rd grade, and Brandon's in 1st. She fiddled with a napkin, her bright eyes searching her father's face. "What do you do now, Dad?" "Mom said you work in business." "Yes, I'm still working with Friedman and Friedman. 1. Invest in companies." Leonard swallowed, unsure how to condense his elaborate job into child-friendly terms. A waitress appeared, sensing the heavy atmosphere. She took orders quickly. While the group waited for their food, the conversation limped along, peppered with stilted questions from the children, halting answers from Leonard, and watchful silence from Sarah. She couldn't ignore the flicker of regret in his eyes, nor could she deny the longing in Sophie's voice as she tried to connect with the father she never truly knew. Lunch progressed in a surreal haze. Carrie did her best to steer conversation to lighter topics, favorite school subjects, funny stories about her daughter Fiona, but the tension at the table was palpable. Leonard tried to appear calm, but he was drowning in a swirl of guilt and memories. He recalled Sophie's infancy, reading finance articles at 2 a.m. while rocking her bassinet. He remembered Brandon's birth, overshadowed by a tense business negotiation. Everything he had missed since was now painted in stark reality before him. Sarah kept her responses polite but reserved. She allowed the children to speak openly with Leonard, to ask him about his life, but she guarded her heart. A part of her still smarted from the betrayal and emptiness of their final months as a couple. Yet seeing Leonard so raw, eyes misting over whenever Sophie or Brandon laughed, stirred complicated feelings she had spent years suppressing. The kids, for their part, hovered between curiosity and wariness. Brandon eyed his father like a puzzle he couldn't solve, occasionally venturing a quiet word about his favorite books or the new puppy they got 6 months ago. Sophie was more forthright, pressing Leonard with questions about his job, where he lived, and if he was married now. Leonard found himself stumbling through disclaimers that it's just me and that he hasn't settled down again. Each question felt like a small spotlight on the chasm between him and the family he once had. After the plates were cleared, the waitress offered dessert menus. Carrie suggested ice cream sundaes for the kids. Leonard insisted on paying the bill, though Sarah quickly shook her head. "We can split it," she said tersely, remembering how finances became a weapon at the end of their marriage. But Leonard insisted, quietly acknowledging it as the least he could do. When the check was settled, Carrie took it upon herself to escort the children outside for a brief stroll. Giving Leonard and Sarah a moment, she offered Sarah a meaningful look. "Now's your chance to talk if you want." Sarah exhaled shakily as Carrie departed with Sophie and Brandon in tow, leaving her and Leonard alone in the bustling restaurant. Leonard leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low. "Thank you for letting me see them," he began, I didn't know how much I missed until just now. Sarah struggled to keep her composure, the swirl of old anger and fresh heartbreak pulsing in her veins. "You're their father. I'm not going to stand in their way of knowing you," she said, trying to sound calm. "But it's not that simple. They've spent years wondering if you'd show up." Leonard's shoulders slumped. "I know. I'm sorry. I was so focused on my business. After everything that happened, I convinced myself that you were better off without me." Sarah's eyes flashed. "That's not for you to decide. You had responsibilities. Our divorce was ugly, but the kids had nothing to do with that. You needed to be in their lives." He nodded, eyes brimming. "I'm asking you now, can I see them again, properly? I want to try. Please, Sarah." She inhaled deeply. The old reflex told her to shield her heart, to say no. But the mother in her recognized that Sophie and Brandon had a right to their father if he was sincere this time. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. "This can't be a one-off thing. If you come back into their lives, you have to be consistent." Leonard reached for her hand, but she pulled away. He murmured, "I understand. I promise I'll do better." Sarah rose, purse in hand. Her heart felt like it was caught in a vise. "I hope so," she whispered, before stepping outside into the bright autumn sun, leaving Leonard behind with a swirl of regret and determination. The next chapter of their story would hinge on whether he could truly change, or if his old habits would tear open wounds that were only beginning to heal. Back at Carrie's apartment, Sarah settled onto the living room couch, releasing a long, exhausted sigh. The kids were sprawled on the floor with Fiona, coloring pictures of city skylines. Carrie offered Sarah a cup of tea and arched an eyebrow expectantly. "How do you feel?" she asked, softly, voice laced with concern. Sarah stared into her mug. Conflicted, she admitted. "Leonard says he wants to be part of their lives again, but after all the broken promises." She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the jumble of emotions. Carrie nodded. "You have every right to be cautious. The kids deserve a father who shows up, not one who disappears." "But maybe he's changed." Sarah shrugged. She remembered the rawness in Leonard's eyes, how he seemed genuinely shaken by seeing Sophie and Brandon. Part of her wanted to believe he could atone, especially for the children's sake. Yet fear coiled in her chest at the thought of letting him in again, only to watch him vanish under the weight of business deals or a new fling. That night, as Sarah tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Mom, is Dad going to visit us in Boston?" Sarah hesitated. "He might," she replied, gently brushing Sophie's hair, "but nothing is decided yet." Sophie looked hopeful, which tightened Sarah's resolve not to let Leonard break her child's heart again. Meanwhile, Leonard returned to his penthouse, a space that felt emptier than ever. The panoramic windows showcased the sparkling Manhattan skyline, once a symbol of his success. Now, it reminded him of how far he'd strayed from the family he'd built. He slumped onto a leather couch, ignoring the persistent notifications on his phone. Business deals seemed trivial compared to the conversation he'd just had with Sarah. In the quiet, he felt the full weight of his mistakes pressing in on him. He thought about how he might reconnect with Sophie and Brandon. Should he plan a trip to Boston? Invite them to Manhattan for a weekend? Could they handle the pace of his life here? Or would it be better to start small, maybe a day at a museum or a park? His mind buzzed with possibilities. Beneath it all, he feared Sarah might never trust him, and who could blame her? The next day, Leonard reached out to an old friend, Dr. Andrea Palmer, who had once given him advice when he and Sarah were on the brink of divorce. Andrea was a family therapist who understood the delicate process of rebuilding relationships with children. "You need to show consistency," she told Leonard over the phone. "Children thrive on routine and predictability. Grand gestures won't fix the past. It's your day-to-day effort that matters. He took notes, determined to do things right this time. Days turned into weeks, and Leonard made tentative calls to Sarah, discussing potential visits. She set boundaries, no last-minute cancellations, no extravagant promises, just steady, reliable contact. For the first time, Leonard found himself reorganizing his business commitments around fatherhood rather than the other way around. Still, doubts gnawed at Sarah. She could see how the kids' excitement grew whenever Leonard's name surfaced. Sophie wrote him letters, while Brandon quietly set aside artwork to show Dad. Sarah prayed Leonard wouldn't fold when deals heated up or his social circle beckoned, because if he did, she wasn't sure her children's hearts, or her own, could bear the disappointment. Over the next month, Sarah and Leonard arranged a visit at a quiet park near Boston. They chose a Saturday afternoon with mild weather, a neutral territory where the kids could feel safe and free to roam without the city's overstimulation. Sarah arrived first with Sophie and Brandon, claiming a picnic table under a big oak tree. She felt butterflies in her stomach, bracing herself for the possibility that Leonard might back out. But he didn't. Clad in casual jeans and a button-down shirt, Leonard appeared, holding a small bouquet of sunflowers, Sarah's favorite from years past. Hesitation flickered across her face, but she accepted them with a polite nod, setting them aside on the bench. Meanwhile, the kids rushed forward, excitement overriding any lingering tension. Leonard crouched down to greet them, arms open in a cautious invitation. Sophie hugged him without hesitation, her small frame gripping tight. Brandon hovered for a moment, then inched closer, allowing Leonard to gently ruffle his hair. There was no dramatic outpouring of tears or confessions, just a quiet, tender moment of reconnection. They began the afternoon with a simple game of catch. Leonard tossed a baseball to Brandon, encouraging him to throw it back. Sophie occasionally chimed in, giggling when the ball veered off course. Sarah sat on the bench, arms folded, watching carefully. She felt an odd mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that Leonard had shown up, heartbreak that such an ordinary family moment felt so extraordinary because of the lost years. They snacked on sandwiches and lemonade. Leonard asked the kids about school, their favorite cartoons, and their new puppy, Rusty. Sophie pulled out a small notebook where she'd written questions for him. What's your favorite color now? Do you still have that big piano in your apartment? When's your birthday again? Each query was innocent, each answer a thread that might bridge the gap between them. Brandon showed him a drawing of a rocket ship, explaining how he wanted to be an astronaut. Leonard marveled at the detail, praising the artistry. At one point, Sarah slipped away to throw out some trash, giving father and children a chance to talk alone. Leonard, noticing her absence, lowered his voice. "You know, I'm really happy to see you too," he told them. "I'm sorry I wasn't around much before." Sophie stared at him intently, as if deciding whether to trust him, while Brandon simply nodded, fiddling with the edge of the picnic table. When Sarah returned, Leonard asked if they could take a family photo. She hesitated but agreed for the kids' sake. He snapped a selfie, Sophie on his left, Brandon on his right, and Sarah slightly behind them, an uneasy half-smile on her face. The moment felt both fragile and hopeful. By late afternoon, it was time to head home. Leonard walked them to their car, lingering as if reluctant to let them go. He extracted a promise from Sarah that they'd do this again soon. "Call me, and we'll set something up," she replied quietly. "But keep your schedule free. Don't disappoint them." Leonard nodded, solemn. "I won't," he vowed. As Sarah drove away, Sophie and Brandon waved through the back window. Leonard stood there, sunflowers still in hand, feeling like he had just taken the first genuine step toward atonement. But whether he could sustain it in the face of life's pressures remained an open question. Despite Leonard's newfound resolve to be a consistent father, the demands of his corporate world did not relent. Friedman and Friedman Associates was in the midst of orchestrating a high-stakes merger between two prominent tech firms. Donald and Lisa Friedman leaned heavily on Leonard's expertise, and Anthony Delgado, Leonard's rising star colleague, vied for leadership in the negotiations. Tensions soared as each executive tried to outmaneuver the other in securing credit for the potential billion-dollar deal. Leonard found himself working late nights again, attending clandestine dinners with anxious CEOs and fielding calls across multiple time zones. The old adrenaline rush beckoned him, whispering that this was where he truly thrived. Yet a new voice inside him, one shaped by his reconnection with his children, insisted he keep his weekends free to preserve time for Sophie and Brandon. One Thursday evening, as the clock neared midnight, Leonard glanced at his phone and saw a text from Sarah. "Sophie is excited about Saturday's museum visit. Don't forget." He felt a wave of guilt. The Friedmans had scheduled an emergency meeting for Saturday morning to finalize the merger plan. Anthony Delgado had strongly hinted that skipping such a meeting would jeopardize Leonard's standing within the firm. Yet cancelling on Sophie felt unthinkable. He fired off a reply to Sarah, "I'll be there." Then he braced himself for the fallout at Friedman and Friedman. The next day, Leonard informed Donald Friedman he wouldn't attend Saturday's session. Donald's brow furrowed in disapproval. "Are you sure you want to hand Delgado an opportunity to take the lead?" The warning was clear. Leonard might lose his edge. But for once, Leonard dug in. "I have family commitments," he said, voice firm. "I can catch up on Sunday." When Anthony Delgado heard the news, he smirked. "Need me to cover for you again, Chambers?" he teased, half friendly, half predatory. Leonard nodded politely, refusing to be baited. The tension in the room was thick. Friedman and Friedman had historically valued unwavering devotion. By prioritizing his children, Leonard sensed he was placing his career on shakier ground. Meanwhile, Sarah was unaware of the corporate drama swirling around Leonard's new fatherly vow. She busied herself planning the museum trip, picking out interactive exhibits for Brandon and an art gallery for Sophie's budding interest. Her skepticism lingered. Would Leonard really show up? She'd seen him break promises too many times, but this time felt different, somehow. Saturday morning, Leonard stood at Sarah's doorstep in Boston. A mild tension hung between them, but Sophie and Brandon leaped with excitement at his arrival. They piled into her car and drove downtown, where the Children's Museum offered hands-on science activities and imaginative play areas. Leonard dove into the experience, guiding Brandon through a robotics exhibit and cheering as Sophie tried a puzzle challenge. He even took pictures for them to show friends at school. Sarah observed from a slight distance. She saw how genuine Leonard's smiles were, how he crouched down to speak to the kids at eye level, something he rarely did before. It stirred a complicated blend of relief and guarded hope in her chest. Maybe he was truly changing. But the corporate world does not pause for weekend museum outings. Even as Leonard helped Sophie press her hand into a clay mold, his phone buzzed. Messages from Anthony Delgado popped up, referencing an urgent development in the merger talks. Leonard silenced the phone quickly, ignoring the slight pang of dread. If he was to keep his promise to the kids, he needed to be fully present. Yet somewhere in the background, the cost of defying Friedman and Friedman's demands was accumulating, waiting to test his resolve. The museum visit was a triumph for the children. Sophie came home beaming, clutching a pamphlet about future science workshops, and Brandon excitedly recounted every exhibit to his teddy bear. Leonard lingered in the driveway, reluctant to say goodbye. Eventually, Sarah emerged from the house, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. She invited him inside for a quick coffee, an unexpected courtesy. Inside, the living room radiated warmth, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of Leonard's penthouse. Toys lay scattered around, evidence of the kids' interests. Artwork by Sophie hung on the walls, while Brandon's toy cars lined the shelf. Leonard's gaze drifted over these details, his throat constricting at the reminder of what he'd missed. Sarah handed him a mug of coffee, then sat across from him, the tension evident in her posture. "So, you keep showing up," she observed quietly. "I'm surprised, honestly. The old Leonard would have cancelled 5 times by now." He took a sip, steeling himself. "I know I've been unreliable in the past. I'm trying to change that, not just for them, but for myself too. I owe them, and you better." She let his words settle. "They've noticed. Sophie especially is starting to trust that you might stick around. I'm cautious, but I can see you're making an effort. So, thank you." A small smile flickered across Leonard's face, tinged with sadness. "I appreciate that. I just want a chance to be a father, even if it's late." Silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "You know, they're at ages where they crave stability. I can't have you sweeping in with big gestures, only to vanish the moment your phone calls. You have to put them first sometimes." He nodded. "I'm trying. Work's complicated, but I'm drawing boundaries." For a moment, he thought of telling her about the Friedman and Friedman tensions, how Delgado threatened to overshadow him, how the merger was at a critical juncture, but that felt like an excuse. Instead, he promised, "I'll do better." "That's all I can say." "All right," Sarah breathed, uncertain but calmer. "We'll see." Just then, Brandon trotted into the room, a small doodle in his hand. "Dad, I drew you and me in a spaceship," he announced proudly. Leonard knelt, accepting the paper. The image was simple, 2 figures in a rocket, labeled Dad and Brandon. Leonard blinked back tears. "Thank you, buddy. I love it." The moment reaffirmed everything, the fatherhood he'd neglected, the future he might still salvage. But his phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with Delgado's name. He let it go to voicemail, forcing a steadiness in his voice. "I'm here right now," he told himself, "and that's what matters most." After finishing his coffee, Leonard said his goodbyes. As he drove back to Manhattan, heart brimming with cautious optimism, a creeping sense of foreboding took hold. Friedman and Friedman was no place for half measures, and ignoring urgent calls was bound to come at a price. The life he was trying to rebuild with his children might soon clash head-on with the ruthless demands of his corporate empire. Sunday morning arrived with a barrage of messages from Friedman and Friedman. Leonard had barely slept, anticipating the fallout from missing Saturday's meeting. He scrolled through his phone, 6 frantic texts from Anthony Delgado, a pointed email from Lisa Friedman, implying his absence left a bad impression on the potential partners, and a curt note from Donald Friedman requesting an urgent meeting Monday at 7 a.m. "Monsieur," he tried to quell the anxiety, reminding himself of his priorities. But Friedman and Friedman was more than just a job, it was the bedrock of his wealth and reputation. If he lost their confidence, he'd face an uphill battle, forging new alliances in the cutthroat investment world. Arriving at the office early Monday, Leonard found Delgado already seated outside Donald's corner suite. Delgado wore a smug expression. "Rough weekend, Chambers?" he inquired casually, an undercurrent of challenge in his voice. Leonard ignored him, stepping inside when Donald summoned him. Donald Friedman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, didn't mince words. He laid out the scenario. The prospective merger was on shaky ground. The other side had balked at last-minute changes, and Delgado had stepped in to salvage discussions. Lisa Friedman added that the firm needed a leader who could dedicate themselves fully, not someone distracted by personal matters. Leonard felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain composed. "I understand," he said evenly. "But as I mentioned, I had a family obligation. I'm still fully committed to Friedman and Friedman." Donald's gaze narrowed. "I'm not interested in excuses. If you want to remain at the helm of these deals, prove it. We have a final negotiation round in Hong Kong next week. Delgado is set to handle it, unless you can assure me you're up to it. This trip could be a month or more. Are you ready to commit, or should we hand the reins to Delgado for good?" "A month." The words struck Leonard like a blow. He thought of Sophie and Brandon, how they'd begun trusting him again, how Brandon had drawn that rocket, how Sophie had excitedly made plans for another museum day. Could he vanish overseas for weeks, now that he'd only just started rebuilding their bond? Lisa Friedman added, "We're not heartless, Leonard, but we need to close this. The window is tight. If your personal situation prevents your involvement, we'll respect that, but we can't keep your position of influence open indefinitely." Leonard felt torn in two. There was a time when he would have jumped at such an opportunity, hopped on the plane, hammered out the deal, and returned triumphant. But now the stakes had changed. Family no longer felt optional. He asked for a day to think it over. Donald nodded curtly, dismissing him. Delgado smirked as Leonard walked past, whispering, "Let me know if you need me to babysit your job while you babysit the kiddos." Leonard seethed, but refused to rise to the bait. In his office, he closed the door and collapsed into his chair, head in his hands. This was the test, the corporate empire versus the family he had rediscovered. He had no easy answers, but time was short, and whichever path he chose, something precious would be sacrificed. That evening, Leonard drove to Boston unannounced, his mind tangled in knots. He needed clarity, and seeing his children felt like the only way to find it. Under the glow of streetlights, he parked outside Sarah's house. Unsure if she'd welcome him, he rang the doorbell. Sarah answered, surprise flashing in her eyes. She stepped outside, quietly closing the door so the kids wouldn't be disturbed. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Leonard saw her worry and realized he hadn't even told her he was coming. "I'm sorry for showing up. I needed to talk," he sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "My firm wants me to go to Hong Kong for a major deal. It could be weeks, maybe a month or more. If I do it, I'll secure my position, but I'll lose momentum with Sophie and Brandon. If I don't, I might lose my standing at Friedman and Friedman." Sarah folded her arms. "Sounds like you've got a tough decision. What do you want me to say?" Leonard searched her face. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I just needed someone to hear me out. I don't want to disappear on the kids again. But my entire career, my identity, really is tied up in that job." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Your identity is more than a job, Leonard. You used to talk about providing for your family, building something stable. But in the end, the job took over your life. Now you're standing at another crossroads. If you want to be a father, you have to be present, not just a checkbook or a Skype call." He closed his eyes, remembering the day he moved out of this marriage, telling himself the kids would be better off once he earned enough. But that day never really came. There was always more work, more deals, more money to chase. "I don't want to lose them again," he murmured. Sarah shook her head. "That's your choice. It's always been your choice." They stood in silence, each weighed down by the ghosts of their past. Eventually, Sarah stepped back. "They're asleep now, but if you want to see them in the morning, you can crash on the couch. There's a spare blanket in the closet." Gratitude welled in Leonard's chest, though he could see the wariness still in her eyes. He nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, stepping inside. The living room was dim, lit by a small lamp. He sank onto the couch, exhaustion overtaking him. The rest of the night was a restless blur of half-dreams, visions of boardrooms in Hong Kong, the kids in a park, Delgado claiming victory, Sarah's face etched with disappointment. At dawn, Brandon woke first, sneaking into the living room. Seeing his dad on the couch, he squealed with delight, hopping onto Leonard's stomach with childlike exuberance. Leonard, jolted awake, realized this was a precious moment he could never replicate over a transcontinental conference call. The job or the family, this fork in the road demanded a decision, and his heart already knew the answer. By mid-morning, Leonard made his call. He dialed Donald Friedman, heart pounding. Lisa Friedman and Anthony Delgado were likely in the room, waiting for his decision. Steadying himself, Leonard announced, "I'm not going to Hong Kong." A silence stretched. Then Donald Friedman's voice, cooler than usual, replied, "You understand what that means?" Leonard inhaled. "Yes. I respect that the firm needs someone fully committed. If that can't be me right now, I'll accept the consequences." Another pause. "Then I suppose Delgado will take the lead. We'll discuss your future with Friedman and Friedman once the deal closes." "Good day, Leonard." The line went dead. Leonard's chest felt tight, but also oddly relieved. He wasn't certain if he'd be fired or relegated to a lesser role, but for once, he knew he'd chosen family over ambition. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing lunch for Sophie and Brandon. She studied his face. "Well," he exhaled, "I'm not going. Delgado can handle it. I'm staying here, or at least stateside, for my kids." A swirl of emotions flickered across Sarah's expression: relief, disbelief, something akin to respect. She nodded, turning back to stir a pot of soup, not pressing further. Over lunch, Sophie chatted about an upcoming school play. Brandon asked if Leonard would come watch. Leonard didn't hesitate. "I'll be there, buddy." The children's faces lit up, as though a small piece of normalcy was returning to their lives. That afternoon, Leonard took the kids to the backyard, rummaging through a box of sports gear Sarah kept. They found an old soccer ball, and Leonard taught them a few dribbling moves. He felt the crisp autumn air on his cheeks, heard the children's laughter echo in the yard. With every kick, every grin, he sensed a deeper bond forming, an invisible tether that told him this was right. As the sun sank low, painting the sky with orange and pink hues, Leonard realized it was time to head back to Manhattan and face the professional fallout. He knelt before Sophie and Brandon, hugging them tightly. "I'll call tomorrow. Maybe we can plan another weekend visit soon, okay?" Sophie nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Brandon clung to Leonard's neck, refusing to let go, until Sarah gently coaxed him away. "Say bye to Dad," she whispered. "He'll come back." Leonard rose, wiping his eyes discreetly. He turned to Sarah. "Thank you for letting me stay. I know this is all complicated." She inclined her head. "They need a father. Just don't break their hearts again." He swallowed hard, voice thick. "I promise I won't." As he drove away, Leonard's eyes blurred with tears. He recalled the day he left Sarah in that penthouse, convinced the world of high finance demanded his all. Now, he was discovering that losing everything to gain a moment with his kids might be the best trade he'd ever make. The road ahead loomed uncertain. He didn't know how Friedman and Friedman would react, or if Delgado would sabotage his future. But for the first time in a long while, Leonard felt he was doing the right thing, and that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, Friedman and Friedman announced that Anthony Delgado successfully closed the Hong Kong merger. When Leonard returned to the Manhattan office, he was quietly informed that his role would shift away from high-profile acquisitions. Instead, he'd serve as a senior consultant, a position that carried less prestige but allowed him more flexibility. While Donald Friedman didn't outright fire him, the message was clear: Leonard's star power within the firm had dimmed. Surprisingly, Leonard found himself at peace with the demotion. Without the unyielding pressure of top deals, he could spend more time traveling to Boston, attending Sophie's school recitals, and coaching Brandon's fledgling soccer interests. Friedman and Friedman's new arrangement, while humbling, granted him the life he now realized he wanted: fatherhood before fortune. He also enrolled in counseling sessions with Dr. Andrea Palmer, focusing on bridging emotional gaps with his children and dealing with the lingering guilt over how he had treated Sarah. He learned that redemption wasn't a single grand gesture, but a series of daily commitments: showing up, listening, and apologizing when necessary. Sarah, too, found herself navigating uncharted territory. She was proud to see the kids' blossoming happiness when Leonard called or visited. Yet a cautious distance remained between her and Leonard. They spoke more civilly, occasionally sharing a laugh over something funny Sophie or Brandon did, but they never ventured into romantic terrain. The trust once shattered would not be easily rebuilt. One crisp Saturday morning, Sarah and Leonard took the kids apple picking at an orchard halfway between Boston and New York. The orchard's rolling hills, dotted with autumn leaves, offered a picturesque setting. As they wandered through the trees, collecting plump red apples, the family dynamic felt almost normal. Sophie teased Brandon about how many apples he could carry. Leonard pretended to measure them for size, and Sarah rolled her eyes at their goofy banter while secretly smiling. Later, as they gathered around a wooden picnic table to enjoy fresh apple cider, Sarah found herself reflecting on the long, painful road that led them here. She felt no illusions that everything was magically fixed. The scars of betrayal lingered, and they still lived in separate worlds. Yet, the children had gained a father willing to fight for them. That mattered more than the glittering illusions of the past. Before leaving the orchard, Leonard asked Sarah if he could have a word in private. They walked a short distance away from the kids. Leonard exhaled, meeting her gaze. "I know we can't go back to what we had, but I hope we can at least move forward. Co-parent as friends, maybe see where life takes us." Sarah studied him for a moment, the crisp autumn wind rustling her hair. She nodded, a faint but genuine smile on her lips. "Let's keep it simple and honest," she replied, "for the kids and for us." One step at a time, they rejoined Sophie and Brandon, who were laughing over a silly apple cider commercial they'd heard. Together, they loaded the car with their bags of apples, the orchard behind them glowing in the late afternoon sun. On the ride home, the kids dozed off, tired from the day's excitement. Sarah caught Leonard's eye in the rearview mirror, and he offered a small grin. For the first time, the future felt hopeful. The cheating millionaire husband, who once shattered his family, had confronted the cost of his actions. Now, as he strove to rebuild connections with tears and honest effort, he realized that real wealth lay not in bank accounts or boardrooms, but in the love and forgiveness nurtured around him, one steady, faithful moment at a time. True forgiveness often blooms from the deepest wounds, and Leonard Chambers's journey proves that no amount of money can repair a broken family overnight. Betrayed yet determined to protect her children, Sarah carved a new life in Boston, never imagining that her ex-husband would one day return with genuine remorse. Yet it was through steady commitment, weekend visits, long overdue apologies, and the courage to sacrifice professional ambition that Leonard discovered a richer bond than any business deal could offer. Sophie and Brandon, once left behind, blossomed under a father's renewed devotion, while Sarah cautiously opened her heart to the possibility of shared parenting.
A quiet suburb, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a secret that threatened to split one family forever. It all began on a stormy night when Mark Anderson, seemingly the perfect husband, let his alluring mistress step into his pregnant wife's bedroom and into her bed. By the time dawn broke, flashing police lights flooded the driveway, and neighbors peered through windows in disbelief. No one could imagine how a once ordinary couple fell into such chaos. But within these walls lay hidden confessions, desperate betrayals, and heart-wrenching choices that would test loyalty, break trust, and leave everyone asking, how could it ever have come to this? Mark Anderson stared at the white picket fence in front of his modest suburban home on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado. The day was sunny, and a light breeze ruffled the neatly manicured lawn. He always took pride in appearances. He liked knowing everything was in its rightful place, reflecting an outward image of success and respectability. His wife Sarah often teased him about his perfectionist streak. In fact, it was one of the things she had found so endearing when they first met back in college. Their romance felt like a fairy tale in the beginning. Long strolls by the campus lake, late-night conversations about hopes and dreams, and shared laughter that echoed through dorm hallways. Mark was diligent, always rechecking his notes and color-coding everything in his backpack, while Sarah was more laid back, bringing a sense of warmth and spontaneity to his otherwise structured world. They graduated together, he with a degree in business administration, she in elementary education. Soon after, they were married on a crisp autumn afternoon, surrounded by family and a few close friends. It seemed they were destined for a happy life, ticking off all the boxes: stable jobs, a well-furnished home, and plans for children. Yet beneath the surface of this idyllic snapshot, a subtle tension had begun to settle in. As the years progressed, Mark found himself increasingly restless, obsessing over career goals, finances, and the desire for more excitement. Sarah noticed changes in him. Little things like how he lingered on his phone too often, or occasionally arrived home late with half-hearted excuses. She was patient, chalking it up to stress. After all, Mark had always been ambitious, and it made sense he might be feeling the pressure at work. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, Mark's reaction was polite and supportive, though it lacked the unbridled enthusiasm she had expected. He hugged her whispered, reassuring words, but there was a distance in his eyes. Instead of celebrating, she found herself chasing him for each prenatal appointment, reminding him of the baby's progress. The more she tried to draw him in, the more he seemed to drift. She told herself it was a passing phase, that once the baby was born, Mark would realize the beautiful miracle they were about to share. But somewhere deep inside, Sarah felt a pang of worry, a whisper that warned her not all was right. Real trouble took root one evening when Sarah's best friend, Jessica Lee, visited for dinner. Jessica, a sharp-eyed, warm-hearted woman with a knack for reading people, discreetly pulled Sarah aside after noticing Mark's odd behavior. He was jumpy, his laughter forced, and his phone never left his sight. Jessica offered her concerns gently, but Sarah brushed them off, not wanting to believe that the man she'd built a life with might be hiding something. If anything, she blamed Mark's anxious state on the responsibilities piling up. But Mark was in fact drowning in secrets, ones that would threaten the very foundation of his marriage. He knew it, he felt it, yet he couldn't stop what was happening. That was the cruel irony of his situation. The very qualities that had once driven him to be the responsible, overachieving husband were now pushing him to take risks he never dreamed himself capable of. While Sarah napped early in the evenings or read baby manuals in her rocking chair, Mark was scrolling through messages that made his heart pound in anticipation. Messages from a woman who offered him a sense of thrill he hadn't felt in years. Her name was Carla Rodriguez, and she worked in the same office building as Mark, though in a different department. She was witty, confident, and possessed a magnetism that seemed to draw people in effortlessly. Everyone at the office talked about Carla's style, her flamboyant choice of bright pencil skirts, and the way she commanded attention during team presentations. Mark had seen her in passing, but only after being assigned to a joint project had they begun to speak. He'd noticed how she laughed at his jokes, how her eyes locked onto his when they conversed. Slowly their friendly exchanges morphed into stolen glances, then to flirtatious banter over coffee. Carla knew Mark was married. He never hid that. She even knew Sarah was pregnant. But from the moment Carla placed her hand on Mark's arm one evening during overtime, gently brushing against him, he found himself responding. He was at a precipice caught between guilt and a longing to escape from the monotony he blamed on domestic life. Carla, too, was escaping from something her own lonely nights and a string of failed relationships. They provided each other solace, a forbidden escape from their real lives. Their meetings were carefully orchestrated. Mark would fake a late work session or say he was meeting a client. Carla pretended she was staying behind to finish a report. They found dark corners in parking lots, eventually renting cheap motel rooms on the outskirts of town. Each time, Mark was sure guilt would consume him, but it never quite did lust, and adrenaline overshadowed everything. But the affair came at a cost. Mark's finances, once neatly balanced, began to suffer under secretive dinners and gifts for Carla. He found himself withdrawing from Sarah's bank account without telling her, always with the silent reassurance that he'd make it up later. He also neglected small household tasks. Sarah, now 6 months pregnant, found herself climbing step stools to change light bulbs and dragging groceries into the house alone. The tension between husband and wife continued to escalate. Sarah was frustrated and exhausted, but she tried to remain understanding. She never fully admitted to herself that Mark's distance might signify an affair. After all, he'd been loyal and devoted all the years she had known him. It was impossible, unthinkable, to consider he would betray her in such a way, especially now that they were expecting a child. Instead, she believed he was going through a personal crisis, perhaps a fear of fatherhood. Sarah confided in Jessica about her suspicions and her desire to keep the marriage intact, no matter the challenges. Then Mark made a fateful choice one Friday night. While Sarah was away at her mother's house, he invited Carla to dinner at his own home. It was a step too far, and he knew it. But Carla had teased him, saying she wanted to see how he lived. That single curiosity overshadowed every warning bell in Mark's head. He assured himself it was just dinner, just a quick look at the house, and then she'd leave. But the moment Carla stepped through the door, wearing a midnight blue dress that clung to her figure, Mark knew they had crossed a line that could never be erased. Carla marveled at the photos on the mantel, wedding pictures, snapshots of Mark and Sarah at scenic spots around Colorado. Even the ultrasound image pinned on the refrigerator. Despite it all, Carla maintained an air of detachment, as though all these tokens of Mark's married life were mere props. Yet there was a glimmer in her eyes, something like envy. Perhaps a realization that Sarah's existence was painfully real and not just some story Mark told. But she said nothing, and Mark pretended not to notice the flicker of discomfort in his mistress's gaze. After dinner, Mark opened a bottle of wine. Carla drank, swirling the red liquid in her glass, leaning against the kitchen counter, with a playful grin. The tension in the air was palpable. Even Mark, consumed by his infatuation, felt the weight of what he was doing in that moment. If Sarah came home early, if a neighbor saw something, or if Jessica decided to drop by unannounced, everything would come crashing down. But Mark brushed aside the fear and let the night's temptations drown out any lingering decency he once had. By the time Carla left, it was nearly midnight, and Mark was too intoxicated to notice he'd left behind incriminating details. A wine-stained glass on the table, a faint whiff of Carla's perfume on the couch. He cleaned up most of it the next morning, but not everything could be erased. Sarah returned the next day to find Mark unusually jittery. He barely met her eyes when she mentioned her overnight trip, merely offering a distracted smile and a quick peck on her forehead before returning to his laptop. Not one to pry, Sarah decided to let him be. Over the next week, though, she noticed more oddities. A grocery receipt with items she hadn't purchased, a new brand of perfume lingering in the bathroom. Small tears in the living room curtains, as if someone had tugged them aside in haste. Her instincts told her something was off, but each time she tried to confront Mark, he feigned ignorance or brushed off her concerns as pregnancy hormones. Sarah, unwilling to ignite a confrontation, let it slide, though her intuition screamed that she needed to dig deeper. She wondered if she was being paranoid. Jessica urged her to keep her eyes open, but also encouraged her not to jump to conclusions. Sarah's mother, Linda, who was unaware of her son-in-law's changed behavior, simply advised Sarah to rest and not overthink. But the facade was growing thinner by the day. Mark's phone buzzed incessantly with messages he refused to open in Sarah's presence. He hid credit card bills and spent evenings out under vague explanations. Each lie stacked upon the next, forging a precarious tower that threatened to collapse with the slightest shift. By the 7th month of pregnancy, Sarah's frustration peaked. She confronted Mark one evening. When she asked him point blank if there was someone else, he scoffed, calling the very suggestion absurd. He even grew indignant, accusing Sarah of not trusting him after all these years. She apologized, tears stinging her eyes, and retreated to the bedroom with a knot of dread in her stomach. It was only after she heard him slamming cupboards in the kitchen that she realized how truly disconnected they had become. Meanwhile, Carla continued her pursuit of Mark, growing bolder. She sent messages at all hours, demanded more time together, and even hinted at wanting Mark to leave Sarah. Mark, torn between his unborn child and the lust he felt for Carla, found himself buried in stress. Some part of him, however dormant, still cared for Sarah. But he couldn't break off his entanglement with Carla either. He told himself he was trapped in a scenario with no easy escape. Each day felt like stepping on thin ice, hoping it wouldn't crack. That was how things stood when Sarah planned another trip to her mother's place. Linda was having minor surgery, and Sarah wanted to help for a couple of days. Mark recognized an opportunity. He promised Sarah he would manage the house and take care of everything. In reality, he was already anticipating Carla's company. He envisioned an evening free from prying neighbors or suspicious looks. This time it felt thrillingly dangerous. He made a mental note to hide all traces properly. But Mark failed to understand the nature of secrets. They breed bigger lies, deeper guilt, and an inevitable unraveling. And that unraveling was about to accelerate much faster than even Carla anticipated. Carla arrived on a rainy evening. Mark welcomed her with a hesitant smile, but she brushed his concern aside and draped her trench coat over the chair. They shared a meal that Mark had ordered and then settled in the living room. If there was any sense of guilt, Mark buried it beneath the facade of a charming host. Carla, for her part, seemed at ease. She wandered the house, studying family photos, with a critical eye lingering especially on the ultrasound image Sarah had pinned to a corkboard in the hallway. During dinner, Carla revealed a side Mark had rarely seen, a near-obsessive curiosity about his wife's life. She asked about Sarah's routines, her profession, her due date. Mark tried to respond, vaguely uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Carla's eyes sparkled with a strange intensity when she heard that Sarah was in her third trimester, as if calculating how to use this information for her own advantage. After dinner, Mark put away the plates and let Carla roam. She ended up in the master bedroom, admiring the pale blue walls and white curtains that Sarah had painstakingly chosen. The bed was neatly made, and a plush teddy bear, a gift from Sarah's friend Jessica, sat by the pillows. Carla ran her fingers along the comforter, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. "You're really living a double life, aren't you?" She teased, her tone somewhere between humor and contempt. A loving husband by day, a wild lover by night. Mark winced but mustered a forced grin. He closed the bedroom door behind him, as though trying to keep prying eyes away from the intimacy of this space. Standing next to Carla, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions: excitement, revulsion, guilt, and a strange relief that she was here at all. The evening unfolded slowly, each passing hour, an accumulation of unspoken tensions. Carla had carried an overnight bag with her, just in case, she'd said. Mark convinced himself she would leave before midnight, but as the clock approached 1 a.m., they were still tangled in conversation and half-empty wine glasses. The rainstorm outside battered the windows, making the prospect of driving home unappealing. Carla feigned helplessness. "I can't drive in this. Let me stay over." And with that, a line was crossed. Mark hesitated. Should he set her up in the guest room? Was that too blatant a sign of guilt? But Carla's cunning charm won. She tiptoed into the master bedroom, letting the overhead light cast shadows across her silhouette. Mark, helpless to resist, followed. Outside, the storm raged on, oblivious to the tempest brewing within these walls. Thus Carla ended up sleeping in Sarah's bed. The place where a pregnant wife should have found comfort and rest was now occupied by the woman who had seduced her husband. Mark tossed and turned throughout the night, haunted by the gravity of his betrayal. In fleeting moments of lucidity, he almost leaped out of bed to make Carla leave. But each time he tried, Carla would pull him back with a whisper or a touch, and the swirling mixture of fear and desire imprisoned him. A part of Mark believed he might still keep everything hidden, that come sunrise Carla would slip away, and he'd erase all traces. Sarah wouldn't be back for another day. He had time to wash the sheets, tidy up the wine glasses, and stash away Carla's belongings. But fate had other plans. Plans that neither Mark nor Carla could have predicted. The next morning, a watery sun struggled to pierce the storm clouds. Mark stirred early groggy and disoriented. Carla was curled up on Sarah's side of the bed, her hair splayed across the pillow. He stared at the ceiling, heart pounding at the thought of all that needed to be done, cleaning, changing sheets, ensuring no neighbor had spotted Carla's car. He tiptoed around the house, picking up her jacket from the living room sofa, gathering wine glasses and disposing of them in the outside trash bin. As he wrestled the trash can to the curb, Mark froze. At the far end of the block, a police cruiser crept around the bend lights flashing, but sirens off. An immediate jolt of panic shot through his veins. Had something happened to Sarah? Did they come bearing tragic news? He looked around, scanning for any sign of an accident or trouble in the neighborhood. But the cruiser slowly rolled to a stop right in front of his driveway. Two uniformed officers stepped out, Officer Paige Morales and Officer Adam Thompson, both with stern expressions. Mark swallowed hard as they approached. This couldn't possibly be about Carla, right? They wouldn't have any reason to suspect infidelity. Unless Carla had a past Mark knew nothing about. The possibility flickered in his mind, sowing anxiety. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to maintain composure. "Good morning," Officer Morales said, tipping her head in greeting. "We received a report about a disturbance in this area early this morning. We're checking to ensure everything's okay." "A disturbance?" Mark repeated, his voice cracking. "Yes. A neighbor reported unusual noises, shouting. Maybe an argument late last night. They also saw a car parked out front that they didn't recognize." Mark's mind raced. His next-door neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, was known for her vigilance, especially at odd hours. Perhaps she had seen Carla arrive or heard them talking. He forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry to trouble you, officer. My wife is out of town, and I was just... Well, I might have had the television too loud last night. No arguments, though. Nothing else going on." Officer Thompson scrutinized Mark's expression. "Is there anyone else in the house with you right now?" "Mr. Anderson?" Mark felt a twist in his gut. A friend stayed over. She was caught in the storm, and..." Before he could finish, Carla emerged in the doorway, barefoot, wearing one of Sarah's robes. The color drained from Mark's face as the officers turned their attention to her. Carla's eyes flicked between them, trying to feign calm, but clearly unsettled by the unexpected arrival of law enforcement. "Good morning," she said, attempting a polite nod. Officer Morales studied Carla's attire, then exchanged a glance with her partner. "And you are..." Carla's response was quick, lacking the usual confidence. "Carla Rodriguez. I'm a colleague of Mark's. He was kind enough to let me crash here because of the storm." An awkward silence followed. The officers seemed unconvinced. Mark's posture stiffened, sweat beading on his forehead. Then Officer Thompson asked if they could step inside to talk further. Mark hesitated, fearing the officers might discover remnants of the affair, but refusing entry might look suspicious. Reluctantly, he led them into the living room, where Carla perched on the edge of the couch, hands clasped in her lap. The questions continued basic inquiries about the alleged disturbance, how Carla ended up here, whether Mark's wife was aware. Each query felt like a jab at Mark's fragile house of lies. He concocted half-truths, carefully sidestepping the real nature of Carla's presence. Meanwhile, Carla remained mostly silent, occasionally offering affirmations to Mark's statements. It seemed the officers weren't entirely convinced, but they had no concrete evidence of any crime. They reminded Mark and Carla to respect neighborhood noise ordinances and to be mindful of suspicious activity. Officer Morales handed Mark her card, suggesting he call if anything came up, her eyes lingering on him, as though warning she wasn't fully buying their story. Just when Mark thought they would leave, Carla's phone rang, blasting a shrill ring through the tense atmosphere. She scrambled to silence it, but Officer Thompson motioned for her to answer. Glancing at the caller ID, Carla paled. She stepped into the next room. Voice low. After the call, Carla re-emerged, looking shaken. Officer Thompson pressed, "Everything all right?" "Ms. Rodriguez." Carla forced a smile. "Just a family matter," she said, but her hands trembled as she tucked her phone away. Sensing the tension, Officer Morales decided to wrap up. She cast one final evaluating look over the scene, then pivoted toward the front door. The moment the officers left, Mark turned to Carla, ready to ask what was happening. But before he could open his mouth, Carla's phone chimed again. Another call. Carla stared at the screen and rejected it, exhaling shakily. "What's going on?" Mark demanded, heart still pounding from the near exposure of their affair. Carla brushed past him, grabbing her jacket and slipping into her shoes. "I have to go. I'm sorry, Mark. I'll explain later." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Mark alone in a house that now felt haunted by the shadows of betrayal and suspicion. Sarah would be home soon, and he had an endless list of cover-ups to manage. But a deeper dread gnawed at him. Carla was clearly entangled in something bigger than he'd ever imagined, and it was only a matter of time before it all caught up to them, before the next knock on the door wouldn't be as benign as a noise complaint. With Carla gone, Mark raced to erase every trace of her presence. He stripped the bed, replacing the sheets with fresh linen. He collected the empty wine bottle and glasses, tossed them in the recycling bin, and opened all the windows to air out the lingering perfume. He vacuumed the living room, wiped down counters, and even mopped the kitchen floor, desperately trying to rid the house of any memory of her. As he worked, his mind replayed the scene with the police officers. He couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Morales and Officer Thompson didn't entirely believe him. Their questions had probed deeper than a simple noise complaint. Yet what choice did Mark have but to lie? Telling the truth would mean forfeiting everything: his marriage, his home, his soon-to-be fatherhood. An hour later, Sarah called to let him know her mother was stable after the minor surgery, and that she'd be returning home by evening. Mark pretended everything was normal, forcing a light-hearted tone as he asked if she needed anything from the store. After he hung up, he crumpled onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The pit of guilt in his stomach felt bottomless. Was it worth it, this double life, for a fleeting affair that offered excitement but left him feeling hollow? By mid-afternoon, Mark couldn't ignore his anxiety about Carla. He texted her multiple times. Mark, 1:03 p.m. Are you okay? Mark, 1:10 p.m. Please let me know what's going on. Mark, 2:05 p.m. Carla. I'm worried. The police thing really shook me up. No response. The phone remained silent, each passing minute, feeding Mark's paranoia. He started recalling random details from their time together. Things she'd hinted at, questionable friends, financial troubles. A mention of an ex-boyfriend who was dangerous. He'd never pressed her for details, preferring their relationship remain an escape without real-world burdens. Now he regretted his willful ignorance. By 5 p.m., Mark heard the garage door open. Sarah was home. He hurriedly got up, plastering on a smile, as though he'd spent the day doing mundane chores. She walked in slowly, her baby bump prominent under a loose-fitting dress. She looked exhausted, but relieved to be home. Without a word, she set her bag down and let Mark wrap her in a hug. "How's Mum?" he asked softly. "She's fine," Sarah said. "The surgery went well and she's recovering. I just need some rest." Together they made a simple dinner, Mark fussing over Sarah, trying to be attentive to her needs. She seemed grateful, but also distant, as though sensing something was amiss. As they ate, Sarah looked at him with eyes that flickered between love and suspicion. "Mark, was everything okay here the last couple of days?" "You seem tense," she ventured. He took a sip of water to stall. "Just work stuff," he lied. "Some deadlines?" She nodded and let the subject drop. Mark exhaled. For one brief moment, he believed he might still salvage things if Carla would stay away, if the police never returned, if he could bury this chapter of his life forever. But secrets have a way of resurfacing in the most brutal fashion, and that reckoning was closer than Mark realized. Late that night, while Sarah slept fitfully, her pregnancy making it hard to find a comfortable position, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the last 24 hours churned in his mind. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, desperately checking if Carla had finally texted him. Nothing. His anxiety climbed. In the dim glow of his bedside lamp, Mark scrolled through social media. He searched Carla's name, rummaging through any clues that might explain her sudden panic. He found her profile inactive, last updated weeks ago. As he scrolled further, he stumbled upon a post from a friend of Carla's referencing a certain mess Carla was in. There were no details, just cryptic comments and concerned replies. Unease prickled through him. He decided to do what he should have done from the beginning, look up Carla Rodriguez in public records. Accessing an online search, he discovered a few results indicating minor legal issues in her past. A DUI charge from years ago, a civil dispute over unpaid rent. Nothing that jumped out as immediately dangerous. Yet Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something heavier was in play. He slept fitfully, waking at dawn to Sarah's gentle stirring. She pressed a hand to her belly and turned to him, blinking in the early morning light. For a moment, they smiled at each other, a brief slice of normalcy. Mark tried to cling to that moment, to pretend they were still the couple who had once laughed on the campus lake. But the outside world wouldn't allow it. As Sarah headed to the shower, Mark's phone buzzed an unknown number. He swallowed hard and answered. "Mark." A voice whispered urgently. "Carla." "Thank God. Where have you been?" Mark scurried out of bed and closed the bedroom door behind him. "I can't talk long," Carla said, her voice hoarse. "I'm in trouble, Mark. I owe money to some people. Dangerous people. The police showed up because they were tipped off about something. It's not about us. Not exactly. But if they connect any dots..." Her voice trailed off. Mark felt his stomach churn. "Carla, what exactly did you do?" A pause. "It's complicated. I made some bad decisions. Now I need a place to stay, just for a few nights. My landlord kicked me out. I have nowhere else to go." Mark braced himself against the wall. No, Carla. You can't come here." "My wife, I have no one else to ask." She pleaded, her tone verging on desperation. "Please, I'll be discreet. I'll stay out of sight. I promise." He closed his eyes, the guilt mixing with dread. Sarah was in her final months of pregnancy, and the last thing he wanted was to endanger her or cause more stress. But Carla's frantic plea tugged at him. In some twisted sense, he felt responsible for her predicament, as if his affair had pushed her to the brink. "Let me think," he muttered finally. "I'll call you back." He ended the call and slumped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The drama spiraled further out of control, and with each passing moment, Mark dug himself deeper into a pit of moral compromise. That morning, Sarah left for a routine prenatal checkup. She invited Mark to come along, but he claimed he had an important virtual meeting for work. Guilt gnawed at him as he watched her drive away alone, all while he contemplated how to handle his mistress's precarious situation. He called Carla back and arranged to meet her at a nearby diner, a rundown place that rarely attracted attention. When he arrived, he found her in a corner booth wearing a hoodie, sunglasses perched on her head, her face drawn and tired. She looked up at him with a mixture of relief and shame. "Thank you for meeting me," she murmured. Mark slid into the booth, grimacing at the sticky tabletop. "Tell me what's going on." Carla recounted her story in fragments. She owed a large sum to a local loan shark connected to her ex and they'd threatened her. She had tried to pay them back, but fell behind. The previous night, she'd gotten a tip that the police had been contacted, perhaps to bring her in for questioning. She believed the noise complaint was a ruse, an attempt to locate her. Mark's head spun. This was more than a simple affair gone awry. Carla was ensnared in a criminal web, and he was now on the periphery of it. "You can't stay at my house," he repeated firmly. "It's too risky. Sarah would kill me." Carla's eyes glistened. "I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm desperate. Just a few nights. I can keep a low profile. If anyone asks, say I'm a friend from work, going through a breakup." Mark thought of Sarah's growing suspicion, the near miss with the police, the unborn child who needed a stable home. Every logical fibre in his being screamed at him to cut Carla off. Yet he felt a twisted sense of responsibility. He'd let Carla into his life. He'd ignored every red flag. Now she was pleading for help, and part of him couldn't bear to leave her in danger. Against all better judgment, he agreed to house her in the guest room for a single night. Carla's eyes brightened with gratitude. Mark cursed himself silently, knowing he was only tightening the noose around his neck. That evening, Mark lied to Sarah again. He said a colleague was in town for business and needed a place to crash for the night. Sarah, although surprised, did not protest. She was preoccupied with back pains and a baby that kicked relentlessly. Besides, Mark had rarely brought colleagues home, so she assumed it was a genuine favor. Carla arrived late, wearing a cap and oversized clothes to avoid recognition. Mark ushered her into the guest room, quickly praying the neighbors wouldn't notice. Sarah was in bed reading a pregnancy book. Mark told her he'd be up soon, then crept to the guest room where Carla lingered by the door. "You have to stay in here," he hissed. "Do not step out unless it's absolutely necessary. Sarah can't see you. She'll recognize you from the police visit." Carla nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand. Thank you, Mark." He closed the door and returned to the master bedroom. Nerves frayed. Sarah was yawning, complaining of back pain. Mark sat beside her, gently massaging her lower spine in an attempt to soothe her. The moment felt painfully ironic. Here he was tending to his pregnant wife, while his mistress hid in the next room. Every stroke of his hand reminded him how far he'd fallen. That night, Sarah drifted off after some time, but Mark couldn't sleep. He heard every squeak of the floorboards, every rustle of movement from Carla's room. Around midnight, a text arrived on his phone. "I'm so sorry for all this. Carla." He stared at the message, feeling a twinge of pity. After a moment's thought, he tapped out a response. "Just stay put. We'll sort this out tomorrow." Morning dawned bright and tense. Sarah rose early to prepare for a follow-up doctor's appointment. Mark feigned a headache, offering to stay behind just in case his colleague needed help. Sarah seemed unconvinced, suspicion flickering in her gaze, but she gathered her belongings and left anyway. With Sarah gone, Mark hurried to Carla's room, only to find her asleep in a rumpled bed, eyes puffy from crying. He woke her gently, offering coffee. She told him she'd be out of his hair by afternoon, having made some arrangements to lay low at a friend's house. Mark felt relief wash over him. If Carla left for good, he might salvage some semblance of normalcy. But just as Carla was preparing to slip out, a frantic knocking rattled the front door. Mark's heart lodged in his throat. Not again. He peeked out a window. Officer Morales stood on the porch, hand poised to knock again. Turning, he found Carla in the hallway. Terror etched across her face. "Go to the kitchen," he commanded under his breath. "Hide." As Carla disappeared, Mark inhaled sharply and opened the door, forcing a calm smile. "Officer Morales, what brings you here?" She looked at him with a stony expression, stepping forward, prompting him to let her inside. "I need to ask you a few more questions about Carla Rodriguez." Mark's blood ran cold. "Carla, I told you we worked together, and she stayed over because of the storm." Officer Morales nodded slowly. "We have information suggesting Ms. Rodriguez may be involved in illegal activities. There's a possibility she might contact you again given your relationship. We'd like your cooperation." Swallowing hard, Mark feigned ignorance. "Look, I don't know what Carla's done. I've barely spoken to her since the other day. She hasn't contacted me." The officer gave a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you hear from her, you'll let us know immediately, right?" "Of course," Mark said, managing a nod. Officer Morales seemed unconvinced, but left her card again, instructing him to call if Carla showed up. As she walked out, she let her gaze linger in the foyer, as though sensing someone else's presence. Mark held his breath until she finally exited. Heart racing, he rushed back to the kitchen where Carla was crouched behind the island, eyes wide. "She's on to us," he muttered. "You need to go, right now." Carla stood, her face grim. She slung her bag over her shoulder. "I'll call a taxi." Neither said a word as they hurried to the back door. Carla paused momentarily, turning to Mark with tears brimming. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all of this. I never wanted to hurt you." Mark nodded, unable to find words. Then, without further ceremony, Carla rushed out the back, disappearing into the alley. Mark closed the door, exhaling a shaky breath. He could almost taste freedom, an escape from the swirling nightmare, if he could manage to keep the police at bay and Sarah unaware. But his relief was premature. For even as Carla vanished from sight, a car pulled into the driveway. Sarah was home early, carrying a bag of groceries. She spotted him at the back door, eyes narrowing with confusion. "Why are you standing there like that?" she asked, stepping into the kitchen. "Who was just here?" Mark's stomach twisted in knots. He searched for an excuse, stumbling over words. Nobody. I was just getting some air." Sarah glanced around suspiciously. "Why are you so jumpy, Mark?" He forced a smile that crumbled under Sarah's penetrating stare. Her gaze flicked to the back alley, the slight disarray of the kitchen, the traces of a second coffee mug on the counter. She wasn't naive. She knew him too well. And in that charged silence, Mark felt the final threads of his deceit unraveling. The confrontation Mark had dreaded finally erupted. Sarah demanded answers. Who was staying in the guest room? Why did she find a woman's hairbrush in the bathroom? Why was the police officer here? Each question hammered Mark's fragile composure. At first, he attempted to spin more lies, but Sarah's teary gaze and trembling voice shattered his defenses. Something in him finally broke. He confessed haltingly at first, then in a rush of words he couldn't control. He admitted to the affair, Carla's overnight stays, the police involvement. The only part he censored was Carla's criminal entanglements. He simply told Sarah that Carla was in trouble and the police had come around to question them. Sarah, stunned into silence, gripped the countertop as if to steady herself. Her face went pale and her lips parted in disbelief. She said nothing for a long moment, then asked the question that terrified him. "Did you let her sleep? In our bed? In the bed where I've been sleeping while carrying your child?" Mark wanted to lie, but the weight of his sins was too great. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The noise that escaped Sarah's throat sounded like a wounded animal, a strangled cry of agony. She turned away, pressing a hand to her swollen belly as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You brought her into our home, into my bed. What kind of monster are you?" She spat, voice thick with revulsion. He reached out, but she recoiled. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he whispered, but he couldn't find words to justify the unforgivable. Without warning, Sarah's emotions surged, and she slammed her hand against the cupboard. The baby inside her kicked violently, as though sensing her turmoil. Trembling, Sarah stumbled to the living room, sinking onto the couch. Mark followed, guilt etched on his face, but she held up a hand. "Stay away," she said, her voice choked. "I need to think. I need to understand how I married someone who could do this to me." He stood there, helpless, wanting nothing more than to console her to undo every wrong decision. But the damage was done. There was no comfort he could offer that would mend the gaping wound in her chest. It was in the midst of this tense standoff that another knock came at the door, 3 hard, distinct raps that echoed through the silent house. Mark closed his eyes, dreading what might come next. Sarah sat upright, alarmed, her tear-streaked face turning toward the tumult entrance. When Mark opened the door, Officer Morales and Officer Thompson stood there again, expressions grave. This time they weren't alone. A plain-clothes detective accompanied them, a badge clipped to his belt. Mark's heart dropped. "Mr. Anderson," the detective said, voice clipped. "May we come in?" Mark stepped aside, mind spinning. Sarah, rising from the couch, locked eyes with him, fear and betrayal mingling on her face. The detective introduced himself as Detective James Carter. "We've been investigating certain criminal activities involving Carla Rodriguez," Carter stated, flipping open a small notebook. "We have reason to believe she's been using associates, willing or otherwise, to conceal her whereabouts and possibly launder money. We have reason to believe you might have information." Mark's hands shook. I only knew she was in some sort of trouble. She said she owed money. That's all." Detective Carter nodded. "She's wanted for questioning related to fraud and conspiracy. We believe she's been leveraging personal relationships to hide assets. Are you aware of any large sums of money being transferred through your accounts, Mr. Anderson?" The question hit Mark like a blow to the gut. Instantly, he recalled the times he'd covered Carla's expenses, the secret transfers. At the time, he thought it was just gifts or petty cash. Had she used him for something bigger? No. Mark lied weakly, his voice faltering. "I mean, I gave her money for personal emergencies, but not large sums." The detective studied Mark's face. "Ms. Rodriguez was reported at this address yesterday. We have statements from a neighbor that a woman matching her description entered your home late at night. Is that correct?" Sarah's eyes turned accusatory. She glared at Mark, arms folded protectively over her belly. Mark caught between fear of legal repercussions and shame before his wife nodded slowly. She was here, but she left. Detective Carter flicked through his notes, then addressed Sarah directly. "Mrs. Anderson, were you aware that Ms. Rodriguez spent time in your home?" Sarah's expression tightened, tears brimming again. "I only just found out." She managed her voice laced with bitterness. Carter frowned, turning back to Mark. "We'll be checking your financial records. If we find any evidence that you assisted Ms. Rodriguez in illegal activities, you'll be charged as an accomplice." Terror seized Mark. This was far worse than a mere affair exposed. He could face criminal charges. In a panic, he exclaimed, "I had no idea. She told me she was in trouble, but I didn't know about any illegal schemes. I was just trying to help." The detective let silence reign for a moment, before nodding to Officer Morales and Officer Thompson. "Let's go," he said, handing Mark his card. "If Ms. Rodriguez contacts you, call immediately, or there will be consequences." As they left, Sarah sank back onto the couch, trembling. Mark stood in the foyer, the detective's card clutched in his shaking hand. The reality of his actions closed in on him like a suffocating fog. He had betrayed his wife, endangered their child, and now potentially implicated himself in a criminal case. His once perfect life was in ruins, and he had only himself to blame. After the police left, silence descended in the living room. Sarah turned to Mark, tears shimmering in her eyes. He tried to approach, to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but she jerked away. "I can't do this, Mark," she said. Voice hollow. "You lied to me. You let her into our home. You risked our baby's safety." He felt the sting of her words, but any defense he tried to muster sounded weak. He could only say, "I'm sorry," so many times before it meant nothing. Sarah cradled her belly. "I need space. I need to think about how we're going to move forward, if we even can." He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to promise he'd rectify everything. But how could he? The scars were too deep. Sarah rose shakily, gathering her purse and keys. "Where are you going?" Mark asked, panic welling up in him. To Jessica's, Sarah replied, "I need someone I can trust right now." Mark nodded, knowing he had no right to stop her. He watched as she left the door, clicking softly behind her, a symbol of the distance that had grown between them. Alone in the quiet house, Mark felt a wave of despair crash over him. Everything was unraveling, and he wasn't sure there was enough thread left to stitch his life back together. Days passed. Sarah remained with Jessica, avoiding Mark's calls, except for brief updates about her pregnancy. She needed to check in with her doctor regularly, and Mark was sick with worry about her stress levels. He texted her, apologies poured out his remorse in long messages, but rarely received more than a one-word reply. Meanwhile, the police made good on their promise to investigate Mark's finances. They subpoenaed his bank statements and credit card records. He had to retain a lawyer, a tired, middle-aged man named Leonard Price, who took Mark's frantic calls at all hours. Price assured Mark that unless they found direct evidence of large-scale fraud, he'd likely avoid severe charges. But the possibility of an arrest loomed, overshadowing every waking moment. Carla, for her part, vanished entirely. Mark heard nothing from her, no texts, no calls. He told the police he hadn't seen her, which was the truth. She had disappeared without a trace. Detective Carter stopped by once more, questioning Mark about specific transactions. Mark tried to explain they were gifts or petty loans, but Carter remained skeptical. Jessica occasionally messaged Mark in Sarah's stead, telling him to stay away until further notice. She informed him that Sarah was safe, but deeply distressed, her blood pressure rising dangerously due to the emotional turmoil. Hearing that Mark felt crippling guilt. He had pledged to love and protect Sarah, and yet he was the one jeopardizing her health and possibly their child's. A week later, the phone rang. Mark answered automatically, half hoping it was Sarah. Instead, Carla's voice crackled on the other end. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she said, sounding frazzled. "I heard the police are looking for me." I can't run forever. I've decided to turn myself in. He sank into a chair, relief and dread warring within him. That's probably the best thing he said. They think I helped you launder money or something. You have to clear this up. She sighed. I will. Look, I used your accounts to park some funds temporarily. I never meant to drag you down. I just needed a place to hide it. My ex threatened me if I didn't get him the money. Mark's jaw clenched. Carla, you had no right. I know, she interrupted. I've made a mess. I'm going to explain everything to the police, tell them you weren't involved. You deserve that much. Anger flared in Mark, but he also recognized this might be his lifeline, the only way to avoid charges. Just make sure you do the right thing. Her voice trembled. I will. I truly did care for you, Mark, in my own selfish way. Before he could respond, she hung up, leaving Mark in stunned silence. He called his lawyer immediately, who advised him to wait for Carla's statement and remain cooperative. That night, Mark received another call, this time from Detective Carter. Carla had turned herself in, and she had indeed explained that Mark was clueless about the fraudulent aspect of her finances. The detective's tone was neutral, but Mark sensed a hint of relief. You're free from suspicion for now, Mr. Anderson, Carter said. But we'll verify her statement. If there's any discrepancy, we'll be in touch. When Mark ended the call, he exhaled a long breath of relief. The nightmare might finally be nearing an end, at least on the criminal side. But the personal damage remained gaping and raw. With Carla's arrest and her confession clearing Mark of wrongdoing, the legal nightmare finally eased. Now all Mark could focus on was repairing what truly mattered: his marriage. He reached out to Sarah repeatedly through messages and letters, begging for a chance to talk. After encouragement from Jessica, Sarah agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe. Mark arrived early, nervous and remorseful. When Sarah walked in, she looked tired but strong. They sat in silence for a moment before Mark spoke. I know I can't undo what I did, he said, voice trembling. But please let me prove I've changed. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. You risked everything for what you let her into our home, into our bed. Mark reached for her hand, but she pulled back slightly. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, he said. Just the chance to be a good father, to be better. I need time, Sarah whispered. I have to think about what's best for the baby. Mark nodded. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a beginning. There was still pain between them, but there was also a door left ajar, just wide enough for the possibility of redemption. Mark moved into a small apartment, giving Sarah space while she stayed home preparing for the baby. He began therapy and parenting classes, determined to change. Jessica helped coordinate visits, and Sarah let Mark attend doctor appointments. At the ultrasound, they saw their daughter's face. Mark cried, overwhelmed. Sarah remained distant, but acknowledged his efforts. She appreciated his support, even if trust hadn't returned. Hints from Jessica suggested Sarah hadn't given up entirely. Still, the wounds ran deep. For now, they focused on the baby, unsure of what the future held, but both still holding on just a little. When Sarah went into early labor, she called Mark in panic. He rushed her to the hospital and never left her side. For 3 tense days he stayed by her bed, helping however he could. As Sarah rested, Mark silently vowed to earn back her trust. One night, She stirred and whispered, "I hate what you did, but I see you're trying." Mark held her hand gently. "I'll do whatever it takes." Her eyes softened. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope. And for Mark, that was everything. Back home, on bed rest, Sarah allowed Mark to help during the day, though he returned to his studio apartment at night. Their conversations grew more civil, focused on Emily's future. One afternoon, Sarah suggested counseling, not to save the marriage yet, but to learn how to co-parent. Mark agreed eagerly. Sessions with Dr. Christine Lee were raw and painful. Sarah voiced her heartbreak. Mark confronted his fears and guilt. It wasn't healing overnight, but it was a beginning. Each meeting chipped away at their distance, offering a small, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, something could be rebuilt. At 9 months pregnant, Sarah went into labor. Mark was at her side through every contraction, with Jessica offering support. After hours of pain and anticipation, their daughter arrived, a healthy girl with a strong cry and a head full of dark hair. As Mark cradled Emily, Grace Anderson tears streamed down his face. For a fleeting moment past, betrayals faded beneath the miracle of her birth. Sarah watched silently, eyes full of conflicting emotions. In that fragile peace, they shared an unspoken understanding. Mark devoted himself to fatherhood, staying up through night feedings, changing diapers, and caring for Sarah during recovery. Though still cautious, Sarah allowed him back into the home, but not her heart, not fully. The counselor advised they take things slow and focus on Emily's well-being. Carla's case concluded with her conviction. Mark was officially cleared, but the damage to his marriage endured. It took nearly a year of therapy and honest effort before Sarah was willing to try again. She laid out clear rules, complete transparency, shared accounts, no more secrets. Mark agreed without hesitation. They weren't the same couple as before, but in their brokenness, they found a way forward, anchored by love for their child and a hard-won trust. Roamed hope found its way back. Thank you for joining me on this roller coaster tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and the strenuous journey toward redemption. Life can twist us in unexpected ways, testing bonds and pushing us to the very edge of what we believe is possible. In Mark and Sarah's story, we're reminded that no matter how dark the night becomes, there's always a chance, however slim, for forgiveness, if we're willing to face our own failings and fight to make things right. Perhaps their story resonates with you, or someone you know, urging us all to recognize the fragility of trust and the power of second chances.